Four-legged loyalty is not just a storytelling place, but also a small corner of the world to honor four-legged friends, loyal, devoted creatures, and sometimes the greatest inspiration in human life. The stories told on the channel are not fiction or embellished details to impress. They are real slices of life, collected from real experiences, real people, and dogs that have left an indelible mark on people's hearts. Today, the story that Four-Legged Loyalty wants to share takes place in the Rocky Mountains, Colorado, USA, a harsh, wild place, but also full of stories of resilience and friendship. It is the story of James Carter, a young soldier of the U.S. Army, and Rexo, the German shepherd who accompanied him through the most difficult days of his life. James Carter, 28, is a corporal in the U.S. Army, stationed at Fort Carson, about 100 miles south of Estes Park. He is not a man who stands out from the crowd. He is about 5 feet 10 inches tall, lean but muscular, with light brown hair cropped short in a military style. His face is angular, and his gray-blue eyes often look thoughtful, as if he is always thinking thoughts he rarely shares. James grew up in a small town called Lebanon, Ohio, where cornfields stretch out endlessly and red dirt roads are dusty in the summer. His family is not wealthy, but they live simply and happily in an old wooden house, where his mother, Emily, often sits on the porch knitting, and his father, Robert, works in a small auto repair shop. James is the youngest of 3 children, and from a young age, he was used to facing hardship on his own. When he was 18, his father died of a stroke, leaving his family destitute. Joining the military was not only a way out of poverty, but also a way for James to find meaning in life, something bigger than himself. The day James left Lebanon, he carried an old backpack that his father used when he went hunting. Inside were a few clothes, a family photo taken on the porch, and a small notebook that he used to jot down his scattered thoughts. He was not a person who was good at expressing his emotions, but deep down, he longed to live a meaningful life, to do something that would leave a mark. When he arrived at Fort Carson, James was assigned to the reconnaissance unit, a job that required patience, endurance, and the ability to endure harsh conditions. It was there that he met Rexo, the German shepherd who would change his life forever. Rexo was no ordinary dog. He was born at a military training center in Texas, where German shepherds are carefully selected for military service. Rexo weighs about 35 kilograms, stands nearly 70 centimeters from paw to shoulder, with a sleek, thick, warm black-brown coat that helps him withstand the cold of winter. Rexo's ears are always upright, sensitive to every sound, from the rustle of leaves in the wind to the footsteps of a stranger hundreds of meters away. His dark brown eyes shine intelligently and steadily, as if he always knows his mission. Rexo is trained to detect explosives, assist in search and rescue, and protect his teammates in dangerous situations. But what makes Rexo different is not just his skills, but his absolute loyalty to James. The first time James met Rexo, he was standing in the training yard of Fort Carson, under the hot August sun. Rexo, then 2 years old, was led from his kennel by a trainer named Mike, a middle-aged man with a deep voice and hands rough from years of working with dogs. Mike said Rexo was one of the best dogs in his litter, but also a difficult dog, not easily accepting of strangers. When James approached, Rexo stood still, watching him with a scrutinizing gaze. James took his time. He knelt down, placed his hand on Rexo's head, and said in a deep voice, "Hello, I'm James. From now on, you and I are a team." Rexo tilted his head, sniffed James's hand, and then sat down suddenly, as if accepting him right away. Mike laughed, patted James on the shoulder, and said, "Looks like he likes you. Take good care of him." From then on, James and Rexo became an inseparable pair. Every morning, as the dawn broke over the hills surrounding Fort Carson, James took Rexo for a walk around the base. He would throw an old tennis ball for Rexo to chase, watching him run with strong strides, his muscles clearly visible under his fur. Some days, when James sat on a wooden bench in the yard, reading an old book or writing something in a notebook, Rexo would lie down next to him, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed but alert. James was not a talkative person, but he would whisper short sentences to Rexo. "Today you run so fast," or "You're my best friend, you know?" He didn't know if Rexo understood those words, but every time he spoke, Rexo lifted his head, looking at him with bright eyes, as if he wanted to respond. In James's heart, Rexo was more than just a service dog. He was his companion, a part of the family he had lost since leaving Ohio. There were nights when James lay in bed in the base dormitory, thinking about his parents, about his childhood, and feeling a sense of emptiness and loneliness. But every time he looked down at Rexo curled up on the carpet next to his bed, he felt comforted. Rexo was more than just a dog. He was the motivation for James to keep going, to believe that life still had something worth cherishing. The story that four-legged Loyalty wanted to tell today was not just about James and Rexo, but also about a harsh test that tested the loyalty of they. It takes place on a cold winter day in late 2024 in the Rocky Mountains, about 50 kilometers north of Fort Carson. James and his scout team are assigned to a training mission in harsh conditions, a mission that no one expected would lead them to the brink of life and death. It was the day James went missing in a snowstorm, and Rexo, with unwavering loyalty, stood firm in the cold wind to save him. This is not a fictional story. It is told from military reports, from the accounts of those in the rescue team, and from James' own scribbles in his notebook after he recovered. James never expected to be the main character in a story like this. He joined the army to find meaning, but he did not expect that meaning to come in the form of a German shepherd named Rexo. When he first stood at the gates of Fort Carson, with his old backpack on his shoulders, James hoped he would do a good job as a soldier. But now, looking back, he knows that his life was changed not only because of the missions he completed, but also because of Rexo, his four-legged friend, who taught him about loyalty, perseverance, and friendship beyond all limits. This is the story that four-legged Loyalty wants to share with you today: the German shepherd and the missing soldier, a loyalty journey beyond all limits. James Carter was not a man who liked to talk about himself. He grew up in Lebanon, a small town in Ohio where life seemed to revolve around rolling cornfields, dusty red dirt roads in the summer, and cold winds blowing off Lake Erie in the winter. Lebanon was not a place where people dreamed big. It was a place where people lived slowly, worked hard, and rarely left. James came from a modest family, not rich but not particularly poor. His father, Robert Carter, was an auto mechanic with rough, oil-stained hands and hair that had turned prematurely gray from years of hard work. His mother, Emily, was a gentle woman who sat knitting on the porch of the family's old wooden house, her pale blue eyes always shining with patience and love. James was the youngest of three children. His older brother, Michael, left home to work in a factory in Cleveland, and his older sister, Anna, married and moved to a nearby town. When James was 18, his father died suddenly of a stroke, leaving the family in dire straits. His mother tried to make ends meet with a small insurance policy, but life became more difficult than ever. James was not a great student at Lebanon High School, but he was a persistent student. He loved to run on the trails around town, often alone, in an old t-shirt and scuffed sneakers. He was quiet, but there was always a sense of longing, a yearning to do something more, to escape the monotony of life in Lebanon. When his father died, James felt like his whole world had fallen apart. He sat in his family's small living room, looking at a family photo on the wall, an old photo from when he was a child, standing on the front porch on an autumn afternoon, leaves falling all over the yard, and wondered where his life was headed. He didn't want to be a mechanic like his father, to live a repetitive life, day after day, without leaving any mark. One afternoon, while jogging through a cornfield, he saw a U.S. Army billboard, "Join and be part of something bigger." The words seemed to awaken something inside him. 2 weeks later, James packed his father's old backpack, an olive duffel frayed at the seams, and headed to the recruiting center in Dayton. When he arrived at Fort Carson, James was assigned to the reconnaissance unit, a job that required patience, endurance, and the ability to adapt to harsh conditions. He wasn't the most visible soldier on the team. He wasn't as big as some of his comrades, nor was he the communicator who would impress his superiors. But James had one thing that no one could deny: tenacity. He could walk for hours over rough terrain without complaining. He could sit still in the cold of a winter night to observe without losing focus. He enjoyed the work, not because it was easy, but because it gave him the feeling that he was living a meaningful life. During training sessions, he often carried a small notebook with him, jotting down random thoughts. "It's cold today, but I passed the orientation test." Or, "I wonder what Mom is doing at home." He didn't share these notes with anyone, but they were a way for him to keep his mind from wandering. Rexo came into James's life one summer day in 2022, when he had been at Fort Carson for almost a year. Rexo was a German shepherd born at the Lackland Military Training Center in Texas, where dogs were carefully selected for military service. Rexo was not the largest of his litter, but he stood out for his intelligence and discipline. He weighed about 70 pounds, stood nearly 28 inches from paw to shoulder, and had a thick, glossy black-brown coat that was carefully groomed to keep him warm during the cold winter days. Rexo's ears were always upright, alert to every sound, from the chirping of birds in the pine trees near the base to the roar of a Jeep engine in the distance. His dark brown eyes gleamed with intelligence and determination, as if he always knew exactly what to do. Rexo was trained to detect explosives, assist in search and rescue, and protect his comrades in dangerous situations. He could sit still for hours, watch, run over rough trails at incredible speeds, and stay calm even in the most stressful situations. The first time James met Rexo, he was standing in the Fort Carson training yard, under the hot August sun. The training yard was a large area, surrounded by barbed wire and tall pine trees, with dry soil and scattered rocks. Rexo was led from the kennel by Mike, a veteran trainer in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair, a deep voice, and hands rough from years of working with dogs. Mike wore an old army jacket, put a black nylon collar around Rexo's neck, and said to James, "This is Rexo. He's one of the best dogs I've ever trained, but he's not easy to get along with. Be careful when approaching him." James looked at Rexo, sensing the wariness in his eyes. He took his time. He walked slowly, knelt down in front of Rexo about a meter away, and placed his hand on his head. James's hand trembled slightly, not because of fear, but because he felt a strange connection. Rexo sniffed his hand, tilted his head, then sat down suddenly, his eyes looking straight at James as if accepting him. Mike laughed loudly, patted James on the shoulder, and said, "I've never seen him do that to anyone on the first try. Looks like you've been chosen." From then on, James and Rexo became an inseparable pair. Every morning, as the dawn broke over the hills surrounding Fort Carson, James took Rexo for a walk around the base. He would throw an old tennis ball, a worn, dusty ball, for Rexo to chase. Rexo ran with strong strides, his muscles clearly visible under his fur, his ears perked up as if he was enjoying every moment. Some days, when James sat on a wooden bench in the yard, reading an old book like Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, Rexo would lie down next to him, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed but alert. James didn't say much, but he would whisper short sentences to Rexo. "You ran fast today," or "You're my best friend, you know." He didn't know if Rexo understood what he said, but every time he spoke, Rexo would raise his head and look at him with bright eyes, as if to respond. To James, Rexo was more than a working dog. He was a companion, a part of the family he'd lost since leaving Ohio. There were nights when James lay in bed in the base dormitory, a small room with white walls, a single bed, and an old wooden desk. He thought about his parents, about his childhood, and felt a hollow loneliness. He remembered the afternoons sitting on the porch with his mother, listening to her tell stories of the old days, or the times he worked with his father in the garage, the smell of engine oil heavy in the air. But every time he looked down at Rexo, curled up on the rug next to his bed, breathing steadily, he felt comforted. Rexo was more than just a dog. He was the motivation for James to keep going, to believe that life was still worth cherishing. Little did he know that, just 2 years after that first meeting, Rexo would become the person who saved his life during a terrible snowstorm in the Rocky Mountains. On a cold late winter day in 2024, James Carter and his scout team at Fort Carson were ordered to a training mission in the Rocky Mountains, about 30 miles north of the base. The mission was not unusual for James's unit. They were regularly sent out to practice navigation, survival, and teamwork in extreme conditions. But this time, there was something in the air that made James feel different. As he stood in the base's courtyard, watching the jeeps lined up in preparation for departure, he felt a vague unease creeping in. Maybe it was the chill of the December morning, when the temperature outside was just 5 degrees below zero, and his breath formed thin white wisps in the air. Or perhaps it was the look in Rexo's eyes, his German shepherd who always walked beside him, as he lifted his head to look at him, his ears pricked up as if sensing something humans couldn't see. James wore his army winter uniform, a suit designed to withstand the cold of the Colorado mountains. He wore an olive-green fur-lined jacket, a thick gray sweater underneath, and black waterproof pants that hugged his legs to keep him warm. His boots, made of waterproof leather and rubber, were laced up to protect his feet from snow and ice. Over his shoulder, he slung his father's old backpack, an olive-green canvas that was frayed at the seams, but still sturdy enough to hold the essentials: a stainless steel water bottle, a box of dry rations, a small first aid kit, and the notebook he kept with him. James was not a showy person. He didn't carry the fancy gadgets or luxuries of some of his comrades. For him, simplicity was a way to keep his mind focused, to keep from being distracted by unnecessary things. Rexo, as always, walked beside James. The 75-pound German Shepherd had a thick, glossy black-brown coat, carefully groomed to protect against the winter chill. Rexo wore a black nylon collar with a small metal tag that bore his military identification number, K4723. Rexo's ears were erect, his dark brown eyes were alert, and his steps were strong and sure as he walked across the hard ground of the base. James looked at Rexo, feeling a strange comfort. He knew that Rexo was more than just a working dog. He was a companion he could rely on in any situation. Before getting into the car, James knelt down and stroked Rexo's head, feeling the soft fur under his hand. He said nothing, but in his heart he thought, "You're always there for me, aren't you?" Rexo tilted his head, sniffed his hand, then stood still, as if responding with trusting silence. James's reconnaissance team consisted of 8 men, all seasoned soldiers, trained to face the challenges of nature and the battlefield. The team leader was Captain Daniel Harper, a 38-year-old man with short dark brown hair, a chiseled face, and a deep, authoritative voice. Harper was stern but fair, always putting the safety of the team first. The other members of the team included Sergeant Ryan Brooks, a tall, strong man with blonde hair and a cheerful personality, Corporal Sarah Nguyen, a petite but agile woman with good sense of direction, and 5 other soldiers whom James did not know well, but who he knew were trustworthy. The team was well equipped: paper maps, compasses, walkie-talkies, flashlights, and several GPS devices. They also carried some survival gear such as tents, sleeping bags, and small stoves for emergency use. The trip began early in the morning, when the sky was still blue, though thick white clouds had begun to appear in the west. The team traveled in 2 military jeeps, painted olive green, with wide tires to handle the rough terrain. James sat in the back seat of the second vehicle, next to Sarah, while Rexo curled up at his feet, his head resting on his forepaws. The road from Fort Carson to the Rocky Mountains was a long one, passing through the arid fields of the Colorado plains, then gradually climbing up winding trails into the mountains. As the vehicle began to climb, the landscape changed. Tall pines lined the road, pine needles covered the ground, and the air grew colder, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. James looked out the window at the snow-capped mountains in the distance, and the unease in his heart grew more pronounced. He didn't know why he felt that way, but he tried to push it aside, telling himself that this was just a routine training mission. When the team reached the mission's starting point, a clearing near Trail Ridge Road, about 15 kilometers from the town of Estes Park, they got out of their vehicles and began to prepare. Their mission was to travel a 20-kilometer-long trail, traversing snow-covered slopes and narrow canyons that would test their navigational skills and teamwork. Harper stood in front of the team, map in hand, and explained the plan. "We'll go through the Bear Lake area, then head north through Flat Top Canyon. It should take about 8 hours to complete. The weather is fine today, but stay alert. If there's any sign of a blizzard, we'll stop immediately." James listened, nodding, but he still couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety in his heart. He looked down at Rexo, who was standing still, his ears pricked up, as if sensing something in the air. The team set out around 9 in the morning. Snow was falling lightly as they left the clearing, tiny flakes drifting through the air, clinging to Rexo's fur and James's coat. The temperature was -5 degrees Celsius, but the wind was still light, just a gentle whistle through the pine trees. James was at the head of the team, with Rexo as usual. He walked at a steady pace, his boots leaving deep footprints in the thin snow. Rexo walked beside him, eyes alert, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air. The team moved in silence, the only sounds being their footsteps and steady breathing. James could feel the cold seeping through his coat, but he didn't complain. He was used to these training sessions, and he knew that this was part of the job. As the team moved deeper into the mountains, the landscape became more desolate. The trails narrowed, flanked by steep cliffs covered with snow, and tall pine trees blocked out the weak winter sunlight. James looked up at the sky, seeing that the white clouds had thickened, stretching from west to east, covering the mountaintops. He felt a cold wind blowing, stronger than in the morning, shaking the pine branches and carrying small flakes of snow. He turned to look at Rexo, saw the dog stop for a moment, raised his head, his ears pricked up higher. "Feeling something?" James thought to himself, but he said nothing. He just patted Rexo's head, then continued walking. By midday, when the team had covered about 8 kilometers, the weather began to change dramatically. The snowflakes fell thicker, the wind blew harder, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold. The temperature dropped to -10 degrees Celsius, and their visibility was limited by the thick layer of snow in the air. Harper ordered the team to stop and rest under a large pine tree, where they could get some temporary shelter from the wind. James sat down on a rock, took a bottle of water from his backpack, and took a small sip, feeling the cold water run down his throat. He looked at Rexo, who stood still, his eyes looking into the distance, as if trying to figure something out. James felt a greater unease than ever. Little did he know that in just a few hours, the snowstorm would hit, and his life would change forever. As James Carter's scouts advanced deeper into the Rocky Mountains, the snowstorm began to intensify. The initial small flakes had now turned into thick flakes, falling from the gray sky like a white blanket covering everything. The wind blew at over 60 kilometers per hour, carrying a bone-chilling cold that seeped through James's fur-lined coat, making him feel as if every muscle in his body was shrinking. The temperature had now dropped below -15 degrees Celsius, and the team's visibility had narrowed to about 10 meters. The tall pine trees on both sides of the trail shook in the wind, their branches covered in snow blowing, creating clouds of white dust in the air. James, walking at the head of the team with Rexo, felt his steps getting heavier in the thick snow. His boots left deep footprints, but they were quickly covered by new snow, as if no one had ever walked here. James said nothing, but inside, the unease he had felt since morning was now more evident than ever. He looked up at the sky, seeing only a cold gray, no trace of the weak morning light. He thought of his mother, Emily, back in Lebanon, probably sitting by the fireplace in the old wooden house, knitting a new woolen scarf. He wondered if she knew that he was here, in the middle of the mountains, facing a snowstorm he had never experienced before. He was not a worrier, but this time, he felt a vague fear creep into his mind. He looked down at Rexo, saw the German shepherd still walking steadily beside him, his black-brown fur covered with snow, his ears erect, his eyes shining despite the cold wind blowing. Rexo seemed unaffected by the harsh weather. He remained alert and steadfast, as if he knew that his mission was to protect James and the team. The scouts had traveled more than 10 kilometers, almost reaching the flat-top gorge area, where they were expected to cross to complete the training route. But when they reached a narrow slope, flanked by steep cliffs covered in snow, the situation became worse. The wind blew harder, carrying needle-sharp snowflakes that stabbed James in the face, forcing him to duck his head to avoid them. He covered his eyes with his hands, trying to see the path ahead, but his vision was limited by the thick layer of snow in the air. Captain Harper, the team leader, walked about 10 meters behind James, ordering over the radio. "Everyone stop! We need to find shelter immediately." But the radio signal was interrupted by the howling wind, and James could only hear fragmented sounds. He turned around and saw his teammates huddled under a large pine tree about 20 meters away, but he couldn't hear what they were saying. James decided to move forward a little to find a temporary shelter for the team. He knew it was dangerous to stand still in the middle of this snowstorm. They needed a place to get out of the wind and stay warm. He walked up the slope, each step heavy with the snow up to his knees. Rexo walked beside him, ears pricked, sniffing the air as if trying to detect something. James felt comforted by Rexo's presence. He knew the dog would warn him of any danger. But as he stepped over a steep incline where the snow seemed solid, he felt the ground beneath him shake. He didn't have time to react. There was a loud crack, and before he knew what was happening, the snow beneath him gave way, pulling him down a crevasse about 15 feet deep. James screamed, but his screams were drowned out by the wind and the avalanche. He fell, his body hitting the rocks and hard snow. The backpack on his shoulder was torn off a corner. He felt a sharp pain in his chest and left leg as he hit the ground, but he didn't have time to check for injuries. He fell into a small cave where the snow had fallen from above, covering the entrance like a thick white curtain. James lay there, gasping, his body shaking with cold and pain. He tried to sit up, but his left leg wouldn't listen. It must have been broken or dislocated. He touched his chest, felt a sharp pain with every breath, and realized that he might have broken a rib. He looked around, found himself in a narrow cave, about 2 meters wide by 5 meters long, with cold stone walls and a small gap in the corner, through which air from outside came in. He knew he was in danger, but there was nothing he could do but lie there and wait. On the ground, Rexo barked frantically as he saw James fall. The dog ran to the edge of the crevice, clawing at the snow, trying to find a way down. But then a small avalanche suddenly occurred, as the snow on the cliff was shaken by James' fall. More than a meter of snow fell down, blocking the entrance to the cave, separating Rexo from James. Rexo barked continuously, his bark echoing in the wind, but no one in the team could hear him. The scout team, standing about 30 meters away, were cut off by the snowstorm and could not see what had just happened. Harper ordered over the walkie-talkie, "Carter, where are you? Answer now." But there was no response. James' walkie-talkie, which was in his backpack, had been damaged when he fell, and the signal was completely lost. Rexo did not leave the crevice area. The dog stood there, in the middle of the blizzard, ears erect, eyes fixed on the thick layer of snow covering the entrance to the cave. He clawed at the ground, leaving deep scratches in the ice, but the snow was too thick for him to dig through. Rexo barked incessantly, his barks fading in the cold wind, but he would not give up. He knew James was down there, and he would not leave until he found him. Meanwhile, the scouts were forced to retreat. Harper, while reluctant to abandon James, knew that staying in the middle of the blizzard was too dangerous. Winds were blowing at over 45 miles per hour, temperatures were dropping below -20 degrees Celsius, and the risk of another avalanche was high. He ordered the team to move to the staging area 6 miles away, where they could call for help from Fort Carson. But Rexo refused to follow. Sergeant Ryan Brooks tried to pull Rexo away, grabbing his collar, but the dog growled and jerked, running back into the crevice. Harper shook his head, telling the team, "Leave him alone. We'll be back with the rescue team." James, in the cave, didn't know that the team had retreated. He lay there, his body shivering from the cold, his breath forming faint white wisps in the air. He felt pain, but he tried to stay calm. He reached into his pocket, took out a small notebook, but his hands were shaking so much that he couldn't write anything. He thought about Rexo, wondered if the dog was safe, if he was somewhere on the ground, waiting for him. He didn't know that Rexo was right above him, just a few meters away, but separated by the thick snow. He whispered in his heart, "Rexo, where are you? Don't leave me." But he didn't have the strength to scream, and his voice was drowned out by the howling wind outside. In the cave, James found a small opening in the corner where air from the outside was leaking in, carrying a few drops of water from the melted ice. He dragged himself to it, using his hands to catch the drops and drink, trying to keep his body from collapsing. He knew that if he was not rescued in time, he would not survive the night. But he did not give up hope. He thought of Rexo, of the way his dog's eyes shone brightly whenever he looked at him, and told himself that if Rexo were still alive, he would not abandon him. He did not know that, on the ground, Rexo was standing in the middle of the snowstorm, steadfast and loyal, willing to do anything to save him. The blizzard continued to rage in the Rocky Mountains, showing no signs of abating after the scouts withdrew. Winds blew at over 70 kilometers per hour, carrying needle-sharp snowflakes, creating white whirlwinds that covered everything. The night temperature dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, and the air became so cold that every breath of Rexo, a German shepherd standing alone in the wilderness, created a faint white mist that quickly dissipated in the wind. Rexo did not leave the crevice where his companion and owner, James Carter, had fallen. Rexo's thick, glossy black-brown fur was now covered with snow, matted in patches, revealing the thin body underneath. His ears were still erect, but one was slightly torn from hitting the rocks as he tried to dig through the snow. Rexo's dark brown eyes, once bright with intelligence and determination, were now red from the cold wind and exhaustion, but their gaze remained unwavering. Rexo knew that James was somewhere beneath the snow, and he would not leave until he found him. For the next 3 days, Rexo stood guard at the crevice, braving the relentless blizzard. The dog had no food, no shelter, only his thick fur to protect him from the biting cold. Rexo's legs trembled with cold, his claws scraping the snow and ice, leaving deep scratches that sometimes bled when they touched the sharp rocks hidden beneath the snow. Rexo tried to dig, using the strength of his lean muscles to break through the 3-foot thick layer of snow that covered the entrance to the cave where James was trapped. But the snow was too hard, frozen overnight, and every time Rexo dug a little, the wind blew more snow, covering his efforts. Rexo didn't give up. He stopped, panting, his breath creating white clouds in the air, then started scratching again, as if driven by some deep instinct, an instinct of absolute loyalty to James. James lay in the cold darkness down in the cave, his body shivering from the cold and the pain from his wounds. He didn't know that 3 days had passed. In the cave, time seemed to have lost its meaning. The faint light from the small opening in the corner was his only source of light, but it wasn't enough to warm his exhausted body. James had 2 broken ribs and a dislocated left leg, and every movement was a sharp pain that made him grit his teeth to keep from screaming. He tried to keep warm by curling up, hugging his fur-lined coat that was torn at the sleeves, but the cold still seeped through every crack, making him feel as if he was freezing from the inside. He caught drops of water from the ice that had melted through the cracks, taking small sips to keep his body hydrated, but he knew that if he didn't get help soon, he wouldn't last much longer. In those lonely, desperate hours, James thought about Rexo. He remembered the way his eyes lit up when he threw a tennis ball on the training grounds at Fort Carson, how he lay next to him on the mat in the dormitory. His ears perked up when he spoke to him. He wondered if Rexo was safe, if he had followed the scouts to find shelter, or if he was still somewhere on the ground, waiting for him. He didn't know that Rexo was right above him, just a few feet away, but blocked by the thick snow. He whispered to himself, "Rexo, where are you? If you're alive, find me." But his voice was weak, drowned out by the howling wind outside, and he didn't have the strength to scream. He thought of his mother, Emily, and wondered how she would feel if she knew he was lying here, in the middle of the mountains, waiting to die. He thought of his father, Robert, and wondered if he would be proud of him, even though he had never accomplished anything as great as he had hoped. On the ground, Rexo faced not only the cold and the blizzard, but also exhaustion and hunger. He ate nothing but a few pieces of melted snow that he licked from the ground, but the cold was draining his body of energy quickly. Rexo's legs trembled, the strong muscles that had once made him run as fast as the wind now shriveled from the cold and malnutrition. But Rexo did not care about himself. He did not think about hunger or cold. In his mind, there was only one goal: to find James. Rexo barked incessantly, his barks echoing in the wind, but the sound grew weaker with each passing day. His red eyes stared at the snow, as if trying to penetrate it to see James below. There were times when Rexo stopped, lay down on the snow, curled up to keep warm, but only a few minutes later he stood up again, continued to scratch and bark, as if not allowing himself to rest. About 15 kilometers from the crevasse, the locals living in the town of Estes Park began to hear faint barking coming from the mountain. They were familiar with the mountains, with the harsh winter storms, but they had never heard anything like this. A man named Tom, about 50 years old, who worked as a ranger in the area, was sitting in his small wooden house, hearing the barking in the distance. He stood up, opened the window, listened in the cold wind, but he could not determine exactly where it was coming from. He thought it might be a stray dog or a lost animal, but he did not dare to go up the mountain in this weather. He closed the window, returned to the fireplace, but still felt uneasy. He did not know that the barking was from Rexo, a dog who was fighting the cold and death to save his owner. In the cave, James began to lose consciousness. He felt his body growing lighter, as if he were floating in an unknown space. He no longer felt the cold or the pain. Everything became blurry, and his mind drifted to distant memories. He remembered afternoons jogging on the trails in Lebanon, the summer sun shining through the cornfields, making them glow like gold. He remembered sitting on the porch with his mother, listening to her tell stories of the old days, when she and his father were young. He remembered mornings at Fort Carson, when he and Rexo would walk around the base, the peace of watching the dog run across the grass. He thought that if he had to die here, at least he would have had those moments when he felt his life had meaning. But he didn't want to give up. "Rexo, if you're still there, find me," he whispered to himself. "I believe in you." On the ground, Rexo didn't know that James was losing hope. It didn't know that the scouts had retreated, that no one had heard its barking in the blizzard. But Rexo didn't care. It didn't act on reason or logic. It acted on instinct, on the deep loyalty that was in the heart of a German shepherd. Rexo stood there in the middle of the mountain wilderness, a lone figure in a sea of white snow, steadfast and unyielding. It didn't leave, it didn't give up, even though its body was exhausted, even though the cold was slowly robbing it of its strength. Rexo knew that James was down there, and it would stay until it found him, or until it no longer had the strength to go on. 3 days passed, and Rexo still stood there, a living testament to loyalty beyond all limits. It didn't know that the rescue team from Fort Carson would be back soon, that its efforts would lead them to James. But Rexo didn't care. For him, only one thing mattered: James, his companion, his master, the one he had chosen to be loyal to since the first day they met. Rexo stood there, in the middle of the snowstorm, waiting, hoping, and fighting a German shepherd with a heart that would never give up. After 3 days of imprisonment in the fierce snowstorm in the Rocky Mountains, James Carter lay in a small cave, his body exhausted, his mind drifting into a dreamy state between life and death. The bone-chilling cold of -20 degrees Celsius had made him lose feeling in his arms and legs, and each of his breaths was weak, forming thin white wisps of smoke that dissipated in the cold air. He had no strength to move, he could only lie there, leaning against the cold stone wall, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow like a candle about to go out. In his heart, he thought of Rexo, the German shepherd who had always been with him during his days at Fort Carson. He didn't know if Rexo was still alive, if he had followed the scouts to find shelter, or was still somewhere on the ground, waiting for him. He whispered in his heart, with the last of his strength, "Rexo, if you're still alive, come find me." But he didn't have enough strength to hope for more. He felt his body growing lighter, as if he were floating in an unknown space, and memories of his family, of his childhood in Lebanon, began to appear in his mind like blurry film. On the ground, Rexo was still standing, a lonely figure in a sea of white snow. 3 days had passed, and the 70-pound German shepherd was now emaciated and exhausted, his thick, glossy black-brown fur matted in patches by the snow and ice. Rexo's ears were still erect, but one was slightly torn from hitting the rocks during his relentless digging. His dark brown eyes, once bright with intelligence and determination, were now red from the cold wind and exhaustion, but their gaze remained unwavering. Rexo did not leave the crevice where James had fallen. He clawed at the ground, leaving deep scratches in the snow and ice, sometimes bleeding when his claws touched the sharp rocks hidden beneath. It barked incessantly, its barks growing weaker by the day, drowned out by the howling wind, but Rexo did not give up. It had no food, no shelter, only its thick fur to protect it from the biting cold. But Rexo did not care about himself. In its mind, there was only one goal, to find James. After 3 days, as the snowstorm began to weaken, the rescue team from Fort Carson, in coordination with local rangers in Estes Park, decided to return to the Flat-Top Canyon area. They had not acted sooner because the weather was too dangerous. Winds blowing at over 45 miles per hour, and the threat of avalanches had made all previous rescue attempts impossible. But when the sky began to clear, despite the thick gray clouds still covering the mountaintop, Captain Daniel Harper, the leader of James's scout team, resolutely led the rescue team back. Harper, a 38-year-old with a chiseled face and a deep, authoritative voice, could not forget the look in Rexo's eyes as the dog refused to leave the crevasse. He knew that if James was alive, Rexo would be the key to finding him. The 12-man rescue team, equipped with snowmobiles, high-powered headlights, specialized digging tools like shovels and ice picks, and a medical kit for emergency first aid, left Fort Carson early Wednesday morning, when the temperature was still -15 degrees Celsius, but the wind had dropped to about 30 kilometers per hour, enough to keep them moving safely. When the rescue team reached the Flat-Top ravine area, they saw Rexo in the distance, a small but resilient figure in the wilderness. Rexo stood there, almost motionless, his legs shaking with cold and exhaustion, his fur matted with snow, and a trail of dried blood running from his claws into the snow below. Harper, the leader of the team, stopped and looked at Rexo with amazement and emotion. He couldn't believe that the dog had been there for 3 days, in such harsh conditions, without food or shelter. He walked closer, knelt down before Rexo, and noticed that his red eyes were still shining with determination, as if saying, "James is here. Help me." Rexo didn't have the strength to bark loudly, but he made a weak, hoarse sound, then trudged toward the crevice, pawing at the ground with his claws as if to show the rescuers where to dig. Corporal Sarah Nguyen, a member of the Scouts and now part of the rescue team, stood next to Harper, looking at Rexo with tears in her eyes. Sarah, a small but agile woman of about 26, with dark hair tied back, had worked with James and Rexo on many training trips. She knew the bond between them, and she felt a pang of pain in her heart when she thought that James might not make it. But when she saw Rexo, she felt a glimmer of hope. She walked over, knelt down next to Rexo, and stroked his snow-coated fur. She felt his thin, shaking body, and she knew that Rexo had sacrificed everything to stay here, waiting for James. She whispered to herself, "If he's alive, it's because of you, Rexo." The rescue team quickly got into position. They carried long steel shovels, ice picks, and even a hand-held snowblower to break through the 3-foot-deep snow that covered the entrance to the cave. Rexo, exhausted, trudged toward the crevice, clawing at the ground with his feeble paws as if to help. Harper ordered the team to concentrate on digging in the area Rexo had pointed out, where the snow was deeply scratched by the dog's claws. He knew Rexo wasn't there for nothing. If James was alive, he would be down there. The rescuers worked in silence, the only sound being the shovels digging into the snow, the picks breaking through the ice, and their gasps in the cold air. Rexo stood by, his legs shaking, but he didn't move. He looked at the rescuers with a determined gaze, as if pleading with them. Hurry. He needs us. In the cave, James had no idea that the rescuers had arrived. He had lost track of time, and his body was in critical condition. The temperature in the cave was lower than outside, only about -10 degrees Celsius, but there was no wind, and the small opening in the corner of the cave provided just enough air for him to breathe. He caught drops of water from the melting ice, taking small sips to keep his body hydrated, but he had no strength to eat or move. His backpack, torn apart when he fell, lay in a corner of the cave, and his notebook fell out, open to the last page, where he had written, "It was cold today, but I passed the orienteering test." He had no strength to hold a pen, but in his heart he thought of Rexo, of the dog's bright eyes whenever he looked at him, and told himself that if Rexo were still alive, he would not abandon him. He did not know that Rexo was right above him, leading the rescue team to save him. The rescue team worked non-stop for more than an hour. They dug through the thick snow, breaking through the hard ice, and finally found a narrow opening leading down into the cave. Harper bent down, shining his flashlight inside, and saw James lying there, motionless, pale, breathing weakly. "We found him! Hurry!" he shouted to the team. The rescuers quickly widened the entrance, using shovels and their bare hands to clear the snow, creating a path large enough to pull James up. Rexo, exhausted, trudged closer, looking down into the opening with a bright gaze. He had no strength left to bark, but he stood there waiting, as if he knew James was about to be rescued. Sarah and a paramedic named Mike, a man in his 40s with salt and pepper hair and strong arms, climbed down into the cave to check on James. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket, checked his pulse and breathing. "He's alive, but he's weak," Mike told Sarah. "We need to get him out now." They carefully placed James on a stretcher, strapping him down to avoid further injury. As James was pulled to the ground, Rexo shuffled closer, bending down to sniff his face, his red eyes shining weakly but hopefully. Rexo had no strength left to do anything more, but he stayed there, next to James, as if to make sure he was still alive. The rescue team looked at Rexo with awe and emotion. Harper knelt beside the dog, stroking his snow-covered fur, feeling his trembling body beneath his hands. He knew that without Rexo, they would never have found James in time. "You're a real fighter, Rexo," he whispered to himself. The rescue team quickly treated James, administered 4 fluids to keep him warm, and prepared to take him to the hospital in Denver. Rexo, exhausted, trudged along, never leaving James' side. He had done his job, not with strength or skill, but with loyalty that transcended all limits. The rescue team from Fort Carson and local rangers worked tirelessly for more than 2 hours to dig through the thick snow that covered the entrance to the cave where James Carter was trapped. The snowstorm in the Rocky Mountains had died down, but the cold was still bitter, with temperatures around -15 degrees Celsius and cold winds blowing through the crevices at speeds of about 30 kilometers per hour. The rescue team's long steel shovels and ice picks dug into the hard snow, creating a dry sound that echoed through the desolate space. The soldiers and rangers, their hands shaking with cold and sweat on their foreheads despite the cold weather, dug and broke the ice to open the narrow entrance that Rexo, the steadfast German shepherd, had guided. Rexo stood beside him, his body thin and exhausted, his black-brown fur matted with snow, his legs trembling, but his red eyes still shining faintly, as if waiting for a miracle. Captain Daniel Harper, the rescue team leader, stood near Rexo, watching the team work with a mixture of tension and hope. Harper, a 38-year-old man with a sharp face and dark brown eyes that sparkled with determination, could not forget Rexo's unwavering gaze when the dog had refused to leave the crevasse 3 days earlier. He knew that if James was alive, it would be because of Rexo's loyalty. He looked down at the dog, saw its trembling body beneath its snow-matted fur, and felt a deep sense of respect. He had seen many military working dogs, but never one so persistent, despite the cold, hunger, and exhaustion. "If he lives," he thought to himself, "you'll be a hero, Rexo." But he didn't dare to hope too much. It had been 3 days, and in such dire conditions, James's chances of survival were slim. Down in the cave, James Carter lay in the cold darkness, his body almost motionless, his breathing so weak it was almost inaudible. He had no feeling in his arms and legs, and the bitter cold of the -10 degrees Celsius temperature in the cave had made him lose track of time. He had 2 broken ribs and a dislocated left leg, and every time he tried to move, a sharp pain made him grit his teeth to keep from screaming. He caught drops of water from the melting ice through the small opening in the corner of the cave, drinking small sips to keep his body hydrated, but he had no strength to eat or do anything else. His fur-lined coat, torn at the sleeves and dirty from the dirt, was no longer enough to keep him warm. He lay there, leaning against the cold stone wall, his eyes half closed, and his mind drifting into a dreamy state between life and death. In those moments, James thought of Rexo. He remembered the mornings at Fort Carson, when he would throw an old tennis ball for Rexo to chase around the training grounds, watching the dog run with strong strides, his muscles defined by his dark brown fur. He remembered the nights in the dormitory, when Rexo would curl up on the rug next to his bed, his ears pricking up whenever he whispered to him. He remembered the way Rexo's eyes would light up whenever he looked at him, as if he understood everything he said. He didn't know if Rexo was still alive, if he had followed the scouts to find shelter, or if he was still somewhere on the ground waiting for him. He whispered to himself with the last of his strength, "Rexo, if you're alive, find me." But he didn't have the strength to hope for more. He felt his body growing lighter, as if he were floating in an unknown space, and memories of his family, of his childhood in Lebanon, began to appear in his mind like blurry film. On the ground, the rescue team finally broke through the thick layer of snow that covered the entrance to the cave. After more than 2 hours of digging, they widened the narrow opening into an entrance large enough for a person to climb down. Harper bent down and shined a powerful flashlight inside, and the light from the flashlight illuminated James's pale face. He lay there motionless, his eyes half closed, his breathing so weak it was almost invisible. Harper felt his heart sink. He wasn't sure if James was still alive, but he wouldn't give up. He turned and ordered the team. "We found him. Hurry!" The rescue team quickly got into position, preparing to bring James to the surface. Corporal Sarah Nguyen and Medic Mike, a man in his 40s with salt and pepper hair and strong arms, volunteered to climb down into the cave to check on James. Sarah climbed down first, her hands shaking with cold as she clung to the slippery rocks of the cave. She knelt down beside James, placing her hand on his neck to check for a pulse. His pulse was weak, but there was a pulse, a fragile sign of life. She felt a surge of hope, but she also knew that James was in dire straits. She looked at his pale face, at his dry lips and half-closed eyes, and felt a pang of pain. She had worked with James in training sessions, and she knew he was a tough soldier, always calm in difficult situations. She whispered to herself, "You have to live, James. Rexo didn't abandon you, and neither did we." Mike, who climbed down after Sarah, carried a thermal blanket and a small medical kit. He checked James's breathing, placed his hand on his chest to feel, and confirmed that he was alive, albeit weakly. "He's severely hypothermic," he told Sarah, "and he may have broken bones. We need to get him out now." Sarah and Mike carefully placed James on a stretcher, strapping him in with straps to avoid further injury. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, trying to keep him warm while the rescue team above pulled the stretcher up. When James was pulled to the surface, the pale light of the gray sky illuminated his pale face, and the rescue team breathed a sigh of relief. He was alive, a miracle after 3 days trapped in the cold cave. Rexo, exhausted, trudged over to the stretcher, bent down to sniff James's face. His red eyes lit up faintly but hopefully, as if he knew James had been saved. Rexo had no strength left to bark, but he put his head on James's hand, feeling the faint warmth of his body, and stood still beside him, as if to make sure he was still alive. Harper watched the scene, feeling a surge of emotion. He knelt down beside Rexo, stroking his snow-covered fur, feeling his trembling body beneath his hands. He knew that without Rexo, they would never have found James in time. "You did the unthinkable, Rexo," he thought. Sarah, standing next to Harper, wiped tears from her face, not from the cold, but from the emotion. She looked at Rexo, saw his emaciated body, his shaking legs, and his bleeding claws, and knew that he had sacrificed everything to save James. She whispered to herself, "Thank you, Rexo. You are a true hero." The rescue team quickly treated James on the spot. Mike gave him fluids through and 4, pumping warm saline solution to help raise his body temperature. They examined his injuries, confirming that he had 2 broken ribs and a dislocated left leg, but no signs of internal bleeding, a blessing given the circumstances. They placed a pad under his left leg to stabilize it, and wrapped another layer of thermal blanket around his body. James was still unconscious, but his breathing was steadier, and his pulse was becoming more noticeable. The rescue team knew they needed to get him to a hospital in Denver immediately, where he could receive proper medical care. As the rescue team prepared to load James onto a sled to head back to the staging area, Rexo trailed behind, never leaving James's side. The dog was so exhausted he could barely walk, but he tried, his legs shaking, his claws leaving small trails of blood in the snow. Sarah looked at Rexo, feeling a pang of pain. She pulled an old coat from her pack, wrapped it around Rexo to keep him warm, and stroked his head. She knew Rexo needed medical attention, but he wouldn't leave James until he was sure he was safe. Harper ordered the team, "Take Rexo with you. He's done enough. We'll take care of them both." James, still unconscious, had a vague feeling creeping into his mind. He didn't know that the rescue team had found him, didn't know that Rexo had stood guard outside for 3 days, leading them here. But in his hazy dreams, he saw Rexo, his eyes shining, standing in the white mountains, waiting for him. He felt a strange comfort, as if he knew the dog would never abandon him. That miraculous moment, when James was pulled from the cave, alive after 3 days trapped, was not only a miracle of survival, but also a testament to Rexo's unwavering loyalty, the German shepherd who refused to abandon his companion. As the Fort Carson rescue team and local rangers pulled James Carter from the frigid cave in the Rocky Mountains, the air was still chilly, even though the storm had abated. The temperature outside was about -15 degrees Celsius, and the wind blew through the canyons at about 20 miles per hour, carrying tiny snowflakes that hung in the air. James lay unconscious on the stretcher, his face pale, his lips dry and cracked, and his weak breaths forming thin white wisps that dissipated in the cold air. The rescue team quickly wrapped him in a thermal blanket, administered fluids through and 4 to raise his temperature, and immobilized his dislocated left leg with a makeshift brace. But as they worked, Rexo, the German shepherd who had stood guard outside for 3 days, creeped closer, never leaving James's side. Rexo, now emaciated and exhausted, looked a shadow of the man he had been 3 days earlier. Its thick, glossy black-brown fur was matted in patches from the snow and ice, exposing the lean body beneath. Its ears were still erect, but one was slightly torn, and its dark brown eyes, once bright with intelligence and determination, were now red from the cold wind and exhaustion. Rexo's legs trembled, and his claws bled from deep scratches where he had clawed at the snow and ice for the past 3 days. He had no strength left to walk, but he trudged over to James's stretcher, bending down to sniff his face, as if to make sure he was still alive. As the rescue team laid James down to bandage him and prepare him for the sled, Rexo lay close to the stretcher, using his body to shield James from the cold wind. The rescue team looked at Rexo with awe and emotion. Captain Daniel Harper, the team leader, stood nearby, watching the dog with awe in his dark brown eyes. Harper, a 38-year-old with a rugged face and a deep voice, had seen many things in his military career, but he had never seen a dog as determined and loyal as Rexo. He looked at the dog's trembling body, at the snow-matted fur and the dried blood on his claws, and felt a pang in his heart. He knew that Rexo had sacrificed everything to save James. No food, no rest, no shelter for 3 days in the middle of a blizzard. He knelt next to Rexo, stroked his snow-matted fur, felt his thin, trembling body under his hands. "You did what none of us could," he thought. "You are a true warrior." Corporal Sarah Nguyen, a member of the rescue team, stood next to Harper, looking at Rexo with tears in her eyes. Sarah, a petite woman of about 26 with black hair tied back, had worked with James and Rexo on many training sessions at Fort Carson. She knew the bond between them, and she felt a deep emotion when she saw Rexo lying close to James, shielding him from the cold wind with his body. She knelt down next to Rexo, took an old coat from her pack, an olive green army jacket, frayed at the cuffs, and wrapped it around the dog to keep him warm. She stroked Rexo's head, felt the snow-caked fur under her hands, and saw his red eyes looking at her with determination. "You did everything to save him, Rexo," she whispered to herself. "Now it's our turn to take care of you." While the rescue team bandaged James, Rexo did not move from his position. The dog lay close to the stretcher, its body pressed tightly against the edge of the stretcher, like a living wall separating James from the cold wind blowing through. Rexo's legs trembled. The strong muscles that had once made it run like the wind now shrunk from the cold and malnutrition. It no longer had the strength to stand, but it still tried, using its last bit of strength to protect James. The rescue team saw this action, and a feeling of admiration welled up in their hearts. Mike, the team's medical staff, a man in his 40s with salt and pepper hair and strong hands, was bandaging James' left leg and looked up at Rexo. He shook his head in amazement, thinking to himself, "I've never seen a dog like this." It not only saved him, but also protected him until the very end. James, though still unconscious, did not know that Rexo was beside him, protecting him from the cold of the mountains. He did not feel the faint warmth of Rexo's thin body, did not hear the dog's panting as it struggled to keep its position. But in his faint dream, he saw Rexo, his eyes shining, standing in the white mountains, waiting for him. He felt a strange comfort, as if he knew that the dog would never abandon him. In his heart, though he could not consciously realize it, a warm feeling crept into his mind, as if he knew that he was not alone. The rescue team finished bandaging James, immobilizing his left leg with a makeshift splint made of hard plastic and medical tape, and wrapping a thermal blanket around his body to prevent further hypothermia. They checked his breathing and pulse, finding them to be slightly more stable with the warm saline solution administered intravenously. But they knew that James needed to be taken to a hospital in Denver immediately, where he could receive full medical care. They loaded James onto a snowmobile, a vehicle designed to travel over deep snow, with a powerful engine and large tires to traverse rough trails. The snowmobile was covered with an olive-green tarp to protect it from the wind, and James was placed on a soft mattress to minimize vibrations during the ride. As the rescue team prepared to leave, Rexo struggled to get up and follow James. The dog shuffled along, legs shaking, his claws leaving small trails of blood in the snow. It was too weak to walk fast, but it tried, as if it didn't want to leave James's side for even a second. Sarah looked at Rexo, feeling a pang in her heart. She knew the dog needed immediate medical attention, but she also knew that it wouldn't leave James until it was sure he was safe. She knelt down next to Rexo, stroked his head, and said to Harper, "We need to take Rexo with us. He can't stay here." Harper nodded, ordering the team, "Put Rexo on the sled, next to James. He's done enough. We'll take care of them both." Mike and another member of the rescue team, Sergeant Ryan Brooks, a tall man with blonde hair and a cheerful disposition, carefully lifted Rexo, placing him on the sled, next to James's stretcher. Rexo didn't protest. He was too weak to do anything but lie down. They wrapped Sarah's coat tighter around Rexo, and placed a small blanket over him to keep him warm. Rexo lay close to James, his head resting on the edge of the stretcher, his red eyes watching him with determination. He had no strength left to bark or move, but he was there, next to James, as if to make sure he was safe. The rescue team set off, the sled moving through the snowy trails, heading for the staging point 6 miles away, where a helicopter was waiting to take James and Rexo to a hospital in Denver. The cold wind still blew, carrying tiny flakes of snow that clung to the sled's canvas, but inside, Rexo lay close to James, his thin body radiating a faint warmth. Harper sat in front, looking back at Rexo and James, feeling a surge of emotion. He knew that Rexo's protective actions were more than instinct. It was loyalty that transcended all boundaries, a deep friendship between a dog and its owner. He thought to himself, "If he survives, it's because of you, Rexo." Sarah sat next to Rexo, stroking his head, feeling his weak breathing under her hand. She looked at James, saw his pale face regaining some color from the warm salt water, and she hoped that he would wake up. She looked at Rexo, saw his red eyes still looking at James, and she knew that the dog had done all he could. She whispered to herself, "Thank you, Rexo. You saved him, and we will save you." As the sled moved through the White Mountains, Rexo lay there, next to James, a living testament to loyalty and friendship that could withstand the test of nature and fate. After being airlifted from the Rocky Mountains by rescuers, James, Carter, and Rexo were loaded onto a military helicopter from a staging point 10 kilometers, 6 miles from Flat Top Canyon. The helicopter, an olive-green UH-60 Black Hawk, its engine roaring loudly in the wilderness, lifted off in the dim light of a winter afternoon, when the sky was still covered with thick gray clouds. James lay unconscious on the stretcher, wrapped in 2 layers of thermal blankets, with an 4 in his arm to maintain his body temperature. Rexo, exhausted and emaciated, lay next to the stretcher, wrapped in Sarah Nguyen's old jacket and a small blanket to keep warm. The rescue team, including Captain Daniel Harper, Corporal Sarah Nguyen, and Paramedic Mike, sat around James and Rexo, their eyes a mixture of worry and hope as the helicopter flew toward a hospital in Denver, about 50 miles away. The helicopter ride took about 30 minutes, and when they landed at the Denver Medical Center helipad, a medical team was waiting. James was rushed to the emergency room, where doctors and nurses in white coats began assessing his condition. He was diagnosed with severe hypothermia, 2 broken ribs on his left side, and a dislocated left leg. His skin was pale, his lips were chapped, and he was shivering despite being wrapped in thermal blankets. Doctors immediately took him to the intensive care unit, placed him under a heater to raise his body temperature, and gave him a 4-drip of warm saline. They took X-rays to determine the extent of the damage to his ribs and leg, and decided that he needed minor surgery to stabilize his ribs and realign his leg. Throughout the procedure, James remained unconscious, his body so weak that doctors feared he might not survive if his condition did not improve quickly. Rexo, meanwhile, was taken to a separate area of the animal hospital. A veterinarian named Linda, a woman in her mid-40s with short brown hair and a soft voice, checked on the dog. Rexo weighed only about 66 pounds, down from his pre-incident weight of about 11 pounds, having not eaten for 3 days in the blizzard. His black-brown fur was matted with snow and ice, revealing a thin body, with deep scratches and bleeding on his claws. His ears were still erect, but one was slightly torn, and his dark brown eyes were red with cold and exhaustion. Linda checked Rexo's heart and breathing, finding them weak but steady, and confirmed that he was severely weakened by hunger, cold, and dehydration. She gave Rexo fluids, gave him N4 to replenish his energy, and placed him under a heating lamp to keep him warm. She bandaged the scratches on Rexo's claws, and gently trimmed the matted fur to clean his body. But Linda knew Rexo didn't want to be here. His eyes kept darting toward the door, as if searching for James. For the first 3 days at the hospital, James remained in a coma. Doctors closely monitored his condition, checking his temperature, heart rate, and blood oxygen level. They placed him in a small room with white walls, a hospital bed with metal railings, and state-of-the-art medical equipment like a heart monitor and a ventilator. An oxygen tube was placed in his nose to help him breathe, and an N4 drip hung from a metal rack next to the bed, providing nutrients and pain medication. Doctors were concerned that the damage from hypothermia might have affected his brain, but they hoped that he would wake up as his body recovered. Meanwhile, Rexo was being cared for in the animal ward, about 50 meters from James's room. Linda fed Rexo small meals of soft, nutritious food, like ground chicken mixed with rice, to help him regain his strength. She stroked Rexo's head, feeling his emaciated body warm under her hand, but she saw that his eyes were constantly on the door, as if waiting for something. On the 3rd day, James began to show signs of waking up. He opened his eyes slowly, the white light from the ceiling shining into his eyes, causing him to blink repeatedly to adjust. He felt a sharp pain in his chest and left leg, but the pain was not as intense as before. He looked around, seeing the white walls, the medical bed, and the 4 hanging beside it. He couldn't remember clearly what had happened, only vague images of white snow, the bone-chilling cold, and Rexo's eyes in his mind. He tried to sit up, but his body was too weak, and a young nurse named Emily, a girl of about 25 with blonde hair, tied up quickly, came over, placing her hands on his shoulders to hold him down. She told him in a gentle voice that he had been saved, that he was in the hospital, and that he needed to rest. James didn't say anything, but in his heart a single question appeared. Where is Rexo? When James woke up, the rescue team informed Linda, and she decided to take Rexo to his room. Rexo, though still weak, began to recover under Linda's care. His fur was cleaned, the scratches on his claws were bandaged, and his body was no longer shivering from the cold. Linda led Rexo down the long corridors of the hospital, to James' room, on a leash. When the door opened, Rexo saw James lying on the bed, and his dark brown eyes lit up weakly but hopefully. The dog trudged over to the bed, pulling the leash in Linda's hand, and placed his head on James's. James looked down, saw Rexo, and felt a surge of emotion. He reached out to stroke Rexo's head, feeling the soft fur under his hand, and whispered to himself, "You saved me, Rexo. Thank you." From then on, Rexo stayed by James's side throughout his hospital stay. The nurses set up a small mat in the corner of the room for Rexo, and the dog lay there, never leaving James's side. Linda came to check on Rexo every day, feeding him small meals and changing the bandages on his claws. Rexo gradually regained his strength, his fur began to shine again, and his skinny body gradually filled out. But his eyes never left James. Whenever a stranger entered the room, Rexo stood up, his ears perked up, as if to protect him. James, meanwhile, recovered slowly. He had a minor surgery to fix his ribs and realign his leg, and then physical therapy to regain his strength. He was still weak, but every day he felt better, and he knew that he was alive because of Rexo. During his days in the hospital, James thought about what had happened. He remembered the snowstorm, the cold in the cave, and the despair of knowing he would never escape. He remembered the faint dreams of Rexo, the dog's bright eyes in the white mountains. He didn't know exactly what Rexo had done to save him, but he felt the dog's loyalty in every moment. He looked at Rexo, saw him lying on the rug in the corner of the room, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. He whispered to himself, "I owe you my life, Rexo. I will never forget that." The story of James and Rexo spread through the hospital, and then through the local community and the military unit at Fort Carson. Nurses said that Rexo never left James's side, that he stood up whenever a stranger entered the room, as if to protect him. Doctors said James' survival was a miracle, that he had overcome the limits of the human body thanks to Rexo's will and loyalty. Harper, Sarah, and other members of the rescue team visited James, bringing congratulations and admiration. They told him about Rexo's loyalty, how he had stood guard outside for 3 days, leading them to the cave to save him. James listened, his eyes filling with tears, and he stroked Rexo's head, feeling the warmth of his body under his hands. After 3 weeks in the hospital, James was discharged. He still needed crutches to get around, but he had recovered enough to go home. Rexo, now stronger, walked beside him, his black-brown fur shiny, his ears erect, and his eyes as bright as ever. He left the hospital with a deep sense of gratitude, not only for being alive, but also for having Rexo by his side, his companion, who had not abandoned him in his most dangerous hour. He knew that his journey to recovery was not just physical, but also spiritual, and Rexo had helped him find meaning in life again. After 3 weeks at Denver Medical Center, James Carter was discharged on an early spring morning in 2025. The air in Denver was still chilly, with temperatures around 5 degrees, but the sun's weak rays had begun to break through the gray clouds, illuminating the city's cobblestone streets and bare trees. James walked out of the hospital, leaning on a crutch in his right arm, his left leg still weak from the re-articulation surgery. He wore a new olive-green winter coat given to him by Sarah and Gwyn, a thick gray sweater and black jeans. His face was still pale, but his gray-blue eyes were brighter, shining with a determination and gratitude he had never seen before. Rexo walked slowly beside him, his black-brown fur restored from the days of care in the hospital. The 75-pound German Shepherd was now healthy, with erect ears and bright brown eyes that sparkled with intelligence and loyalty. Rexo stayed by James's side, never leaving his side, as if knowing that his mission to protect him was not over. James decided not to return to Fort Carson or continue his military career. After what had happened in the Rocky Mountains, he realized that his life needed a new direction, one that was not only for himself, but also for Rexo, the companion who had saved his life. He applied for early retirement from the military, citing his health as no longer fit for active duty, and was granted it after doctors confirmed that his injuries, though healed, would leave him with lasting effects. He had no regrets. The military had given him a purpose in life, but Rexo had given him a reason to live. He packed his belongings from the dormitory at Fort Carson, a few clothes, his father's old backpack, and the small notebook where he jotted down his scattered thoughts, and headed back to Lebanon, Ohio, where his mother, Emily, was waiting. The journey from Denver to Lebanon took more than 20 hours by car, with James driving the old blue Ford pickup he'd bought from a fellow soldier at Fort Carson. Rexo sat in the passenger seat, his head resting on the seat, his eyes half closed but alert to every sound outside. James drove through endless highways, through the dry fields of Kansas, through small towns in Missouri, and finally the familiar cornfields of Ohio. He stopped several times to rest, eating simple meals like sandwiches and black coffee at roadside rest stops. At each stop, Rexo got out of the car and walked beside him, ears pricked as if to make sure he was safe. James looked at Rexo, feeling a deep sense of comfort. He thought to himself, "You didn't leave me when I needed you most. I won't leave you now." When James reached Lebanon, he drove down familiar red dirt roads, past cornfields that had begun to turn green after winter. He stopped in front of his family's old wooden house, where his mother, Emily, stood on the porch, wearing a beige sweater and a scarf. Emily, now 60, with white hair and pale blue eyes like James, stepped out to greet him, her hands shaking with emotion. She hugged James tightly, tears streaming down her wrinkled face as she saw him alive, though he was still weak and on crutches. She didn't know much about what had happened in the Rocky Mountains, only that he had been in danger and had been saved. When she saw Rexo step out of the car and walk beside James, she knelt down and stroked his head, feeling the soft fur under her hand. She whispered to herself, "Thank you for bringing my son back." James decided to use his military savings to buy a small house near Lebanon, about 3 miles from his mother's house. The house was a one-story wooden house with a red tile roof and a large backyard where Rexo could run around freely. He fixed it up with the help of his brother Michael, who had returned from Cleveland to visit him after hearing about the incident. Michael, a tall, dark brown-haired 32-year-old, didn't say much, but he spent his days helping James paint the walls, fix the roof, and build a wooden fence around the yard. James and Rexo moved into their new house in mid-spring, when the corn plants around Lebanon were starting to grow, and sunlight filtered through the trees, brightening their small yard. James and Rexo took walks along the country roads around Lebanon every afternoon. James needed crutches for the first few months, but he gradually abandoned them as his left leg healed through physical therapy. He walked slowly, taking in the fresh spring air, the scent of damp earth and green grass filling his nostrils. Rexo walked beside him, ears perked, eyes bright, occasionally darting a few steps ahead to chase a squirrel or sniff the grass along the road. James looked at Rexo, feeling a peace he had never known before. He thought of his days at Fort Carson, of the grueling training, of the blizzard in the Rocky Mountains, and of how Rexo had stood guard outside the cave for 3 days to save him. He knew he would never forget Rexo's loyalty, and he decided to spend the rest of his life caring for the dog, the friend who had not abandoned him in his hour of need. The story of James and Rexo spread throughout the local community in Lebanon and James's old army unit at Fort Carson. Neighbors in Lebanon, who had known James since he was a child, came to visit him, bringing gifts like homemade cookies and jams. They sat in his yard, listening to him tell the story of Rexo and how the dog's loyalty saved his life. They watched Rexo, now healthy and happy, run around the yard and felt a deep sense of awe. At Fort Carson, Captain Daniel Harper, Corporal Sarah Nguyen, and other members of the rescue team told the story to new soldiers, making James and Rexo symbols of loyalty and camaraderie in the unit. Harper even offered Rexo a military medal of honor, but James declined, saying Rexo didn't need a medal, he just needed him. Rexo, now 5 years old, lives happily with James in their small home in Lebanon. He no longer faces the rigors of military duty, no longer running through rough trails or sniffing out explosives. Instead, he lived a peaceful life, running around the yard, lying on the porch while James read, and walking with him on country roads. James cared for Rexo with love and gratitude, feeding him nutritious meals, taking him to the vet regularly, and stroking his head every night before bed. He looked at Rexo, saw the light in his eyes, and felt that he had found the true meaning of life not in military missions or titles, but in the deep friendship with Rexo. For James, the story in the Rocky Mountains was not just a painful memory, but also a profound lesson. He learned that loyalty can overcome all limits, that the friendship between man and animal is a strong, precious bond. He learned that perseverance can lead to hope, that Rexo did not give up on him even when everything seemed hopeless. And he learned that four-legged friends like Rexo deserve to be loved and cared for, not just because of what they do for us, but because they are a part of our lives. Every time James looks at Rexo, he whispers to himself, "Thank you, Rexo. I will never forget what you have done for me." James and Rexo's story ends in peace and happiness, but the lesson from it remains forever. It is a lesson in Rexo's absolute loyalty, when the dog did not abandon James despite hunger, cold, and danger. It is a lesson in strong friendship, when the relationship between James and Rexo overcomes all challenges to become a living testament to the bond between humans and animals. It is a lesson in perseverance leading to hope, when Rexo stood guard for 3 days to lead the rescue team to save James. And that is a lesson in appreciating four-legged friends, when Rexo not only saved James' life, but also helped him find the meaning of life again. James and Rexo lived together in a small house in Lebanon, a testament to friendship that transcends all limits, a story that four-legged loyalty will forever tell to honor loyal dogs like Rexo.